Okay. Okay, Noah, I just have a couple of questions here for you. First of all, under the idea of philosophy, you would agree that you are ending all...
We're ending all of the over-federalization in the system, when the
Right.
system prosecutes single-state, nonviolent drug crimes.
All right. And because you're doing that, you're basically ending all ability for them to prosecute an intrastate and do things like that.
No, we're mending...
Intrastate, pardon me.
Intrastate?
Right, which is single state. You're
They
removing...
can still prosecute it if it's appealed to the federal courts. The criminal can appeal
Okay.
to the federal courts if they need to. Or if it is in fact between intrastate. If the Supreme Court wants to define single-state crimes as intrastate, then I guess technically it could still have a little bit of power over that.
Okay, the question I'm asking is whether or not you're ending their ability to specifically prosecute independently.
We're mending their jurisdiction by ending
Okay.
this over-federalization, if that's what you're asking.
Okay, so things like mandatory minimums on those things
That
are
is a
largely
root,
ended.
that is a problem of over-federalization, prosecuting single-state, low-level crimes and giving them vastly unjust sentences. So by ending this over-federalization, we solve for this consequence of over-federalization.
Okay, I'll move on.
Okay.
You talked about over-federalization, obviously, a whole lot in your speech. Is that basically over-criminalization in the federal court?
There's two different things. One is over-criminalization. That's just having statutes for everything. The other one, over-federalization, is when I'm taking state statutes and I'm making duplicative statutes that the states already have. That would be over-federalization.
Okay. Well, with the one specifically of over-criminalization, you would agree that that also happens on a state level, that there are a lot of state laws.
Over-criminalization is not what we're trying to solve for in this plan. We can't abolish laws, we can't abolish state laws, we can't really solve for that under this resolution that we've
Okay, I
been
think I
given.
understand. Thank you.
Okay.
Can we both agree that case precedent set up by the Supreme Court is very important?
Case precedent set up by the Supreme Court is only important when it sets good precedents. For instance, things like Plessy v. Ferguson and cases that were not what our founders would have wanted or were not what morally is justifiable, those aren't good case precedents.
Okay.
Although some Supreme Court precedents have in fact been good things.
Okay, but you would agree that we can't just decide and pick and choose which ones are the best. They have to have that overall power.
That's not true. I think we can definitely go back to what our founders intended and make reforms
Okay.
that put them back in constitutional limits.
Right, and whose job is it to interpret that? Is that your job?
Well, according to Alexander Hamilton, it is in fact the federal government's, not the federal government's job, but the state government's job for these ordinary administration of justice.
All right, well, we're running out of time, so finally, when you talked about that you're fixing the root problem, did you ever prove that things like altering the mandatory minimum sentences wouldn't fix those things like prison?
Altering the mandatory minimum sentences don't fix the root problem. The root problem is over-federalization, and there is a multitude of harms that come from that. In fact, we have an entire list of all of the harms right here if you'd like to look at those.
I think that's okay. Thank you so much, Noah.
All right, no problem.
Move this box very far.
I find it interesting that the affirmative speakers continually refer to what the founders intended. And then they say the founders were against over-federalization, just generally. You see, they never have actually given us any specific quotes or anything from the founders that explicitly say that the federal courts shouldn't regulate single-state drug crimes and non-violent crimes. What they're doing is they're using these generic claims that they found from these professors and the like, and then they're narrowing it down and drawing a line themselves that they don't even really understand. And we're going to be kind of exploring this flawed mindset along with a couple of others throughout this speech as we basically just go down and look at how the affirmative team is looking at general ideas and making them specific in a way that they don't even really understand. At the end of the day, we're going to see that though they have noble goals, their actual policy simply can't achieve it. It's an unworkable policy. You see, noble goals don't make an effective policy. And the first thing that we're going to get into is actually specifics. You see, in the first cross-examination, I asked Nate, I said, do you know what specific laws you're abolishing? And he said, we don't have a list of that. They have no idea what laws they're specifically abolishing. They're just trying to reduce over-federalization, but they haven't given us a list specifically of what would be abolished under their plan. We need to actually see this because otherwise we're voting for an uninformed policy. Now, the second thing we need to look at is even more important than this, and it's our first kind of critique of their mindset that we need to go over. You see, the affirmative team is approaching today's round with kind of the wrong idea in mind. They don't understand the core purpose of our federal court system. You see, the reason we have a federal court system in the first place is to enable our federal government to basically regulate international and interstate commerce. It allows the federal government to regulate their own laws and to kind of enforce those. And so when you take away the government's ability to actually regulate those laws, you effectively take away the purpose of our federal court system. Our federal court system wasn't meant to be some weak entity. It was meant to stand by and protect people using federal laws. The problems they're citing stem directly from federal laws. And this actually brings me to my second mindset critique. This over-federalization they continually are talking about is referring to these laws. Every single time it talks about the high sentences and people being in prison for a long time. Those are the laws. Those are the mandatory minimums. The courts are enforcing those correctly. The laws are the inherent problem when it comes to over-federalization, and that's what they need to be addressing. And this brings us to our third mindset critique, and this is the idea that if their plan is the only one in the round, it's the one you should vote for. In the last affirmative speech, Noah got up here and he talked about how their plan is the optimal one, because in today's round, you only have two options. You have the affirmative team's plan and you have the negative team's plan. And he essentially said, as long as our plan is marginally better than the current system, you should vote for it. Our stance as a negative team is basically this. Our job, as Nate agreed in the first cross-examination, is to refute their case and essentially say that it's the wrong idea. Our point isn't that their case maybe wouldn't work to some extent, though we're going to get to that a little bit later. Our point is simply we need to go back to the drawing board. At the end of the day, their plan really isn't the right option. And if you pass it, it's going to cause more harms than if we were to go back to the drawing board and try again. There are reforms that would work better. So that's the third mindset critique. Essentially, if their plan is the only one in the round, it's the one we should vote for. As a negative team, we say we should go back to the drawing board. The fourth mindset critique is actually talking about this line that they're drawing. You see, the affirmative team continually is talking about over-federalization. We already talked about this. And then they say, we're drawing the line between nonviolent and violent crimes. Essentially, violent crimes that are single state are going to stay the way they are. If the affirmative team really stands by this mindset that over-federalization is the problem and that the federal court should only regulate interstate commerce, then they need to only have a policy that addresses all of that. But for some reason, they've drawn this line between violent and non-violent. This really doesn't make any sense. Essentially, what we're asking the affirmative team to do is to explain to us, first of all, what specific laws they're abolishing. We need to understand what laws they're abolishing, because if we don't understand that, we don't even know what their policy is in the first place. And secondarily, we need them to actually prove that the problem is with the federal court system and not our federal laws. That's the issue with their policy being the wrong one. If the federal laws stay the same, nothing will change. And this brings us to a couple of disadvantages. You see, when you approach a system with the wrong mindset, you end up doing things wrongly. And when you have a blanket policy like the affirmative teams as well, it simply causes more harm than good. And this gets us into our first disadvantage, uninformed policy. You see, the advocates they're bringing up don't actually specifically advocate their plan. I've asked them to bring up a PhD or even just a law professor that simply says that their plan inherently is justified. And they're continually reading quotes that say over-federalization is a bad thing. It's not what the founders intended. But that has nothing to do with the federal court system specifically regulating single-state commerce. The quote that they keep referring to, which I believe is from Edwin Meese, the one that they read back in their 1AC, and Noah also opened with this one, said the drafters of the Constitution clearly intended the states to bear responsibility for public safety and ordinary administration of justice. But nowhere in this quote does it say, therefore, we should abolish all single-state federal crimes. It never says this. We need an actual advocate specifically saying that the reason or the way we solve over-federalization is through their plan. And until we see this, we're voting for an uninformed policy. But the second disadvantage is even more important. It's that of inconsistent regulation. If you look back to cross-examination when I was talking to Nate, I asked him if states also kind of vary, if within each state there are different laws. And he responded, yes, each state has totally different drug laws. And he gave me a complete list back at the table. And each one was totally different. The average sentences per state change. Yes, some states use judge discretion and some of them have mandatory minimums. It changes per state. And so when you put all of the power into the states to regulate commerce, you have inconsistent regulation. Essentially, in one state, it may be very easy to just get 6 months in jail for 45 pounds of marijuana, whereas in another one, it's 6 years in prison. And when you have inconsistent regulation, it leads us to our third disadvantage, which is inconsistent enforcement. Again, if we look back to my mindset critique I talked about earlier, the affirmative team is missing that we have to enforce federal laws because we have to have consistent enforcement. It's the only way to get consistent justice. So when you pass their plan and you put this all on the state level, it causes everything to be in disparity and basically ruins the entire consistency when it comes to regulating laws. And this leads me to my fourth disadvantage, and that's a locked-in precedent. You see, when the Supreme Court decides on an issue, as we already agreed in cross-examination, it kind of creates a precedent that everyone in the nation has to follow. It's almost an unspoken law. It's basically how the Supreme Court functions. And so when you take away the Supreme Court's ability to regulate certain laws, as the affirmative team is doing, that means any precedent that they've set in the past is now set forever, because they can't rule on those issues anymore. So when you vote affirmative and they take laws out of federal jurisdiction, it effectively locks in any decisions they made before. So let's say in 200 years we need to change a certain decision, we can't because you voted affirmative. And my fifth disadvantage is the most important one. They're using a sledgehammer, not a chisel. They're trying to build a statue and reduce the generic over-federalization, but because their plan is a blunt force, it simply can't achieve what they're saying it will. At the end of the day, they may have noble goals, but a sledgehammer can never build a statue.
Alright, is my judge ready? Alright, now.
Yeah.
Alright, let's begin. Have you ever been to the Guggenheim Museum?
I have no idea what that is.
Okay, it's a modern art museum in New York, and can we agree that in that museum there's actually just a crumbled wall that's one of the things? That's one of their main pieces of
I
art.
didn't
It's
know
the
the
statue,
museum-
the crumbled wall.
I didn't know the museum existed, but I'll take your word for it.
Alright, and you would agree that the best way to crumble a wall is with a sledgehammer?
I would use TNT personally, but sure.
Okay, but that'd get a blown up wall, correct?
I prefer blown up walls, and I would kind of put the
Okay.
pieces back together to make them crumble. But if you like
Okay.
a sledgehammer, you can definitely use that as well.
Alright, moving on, can you define the ordinary administration of justice for me?
The ordinary administration of justice.
What would you think that would mean?
Do you mean ordinary as in the realm of our current nation?
As in,
or-
what is ordinary administration of justice? What do you think would fall under the ordinary
Well,
administration
assuming
of
that
justice?
you're interpreting that as ordinary, as like the norm right now, I would say the interpretation of justice is essentially getting what you deserve.
Okay, moving on, are we, as the affirmative team, abolishing any laws?
I believe you did say that you're abolishing
Okay,
single
are we
state laws when
abolishing
it
them,
comes
or
to
are
the
we
federal
curbing their
courts.
applicability?
When it comes to the federal courts, you're essentially nullifying federal laws that deal with.
Okay, can we agree federal laws actually, they rule on the specific crime, not whether or not the crime is interstate or intrastate?
Well, there are two different kind of facets of federal law. There are federal laws that are meant to deal with intrastate, and then there are federal laws that are meant to
Okay,
deal
that's
with
interesting.
interstate.
Why wouldn't the same statutes apply to both?
Well, they have the same statutes, but they have
Exactly.
different regulations.
Okay, alright, moving on. Can we agree that, say, if someone from, take the school shooting in Colorado, for example.
Okay.
This guy from Colorado bought a gun in Colorado and shot up a school full of kids in Colorado, who were all citizens of Colorado.
Okay.
Should that be a state crime or a federal crime, because it was clearly terrorism?
It should definitely be a federal crime.
Okay, and that would be a violent crime, correct?
Sure.
And we're not removing violent crimes,
No,
because
as I
that
was
would be
talking
bad.
about, the line that you're drawing there is contradictory, because if you claim that the problem is over-federalization, that
Okay.
applies to violent crimes.
Can we
as
agree
well.
that my specific advocate, the JD from Yale, John D. Oakley,
Sure.
actually says that the drug crimes are the ones that are being over-federalized?
I don't believe that you've read that quote so far. If you'd
Are
like
you
to give us-
sure? Because I read that in my last speech.
If I missed it, I'm sorry. If you'd like to
Okay.
give us that back at the table, we can definitely take a look
Alright,
at it.
moving on. You said you had that whole list of the state crimes back there,
I
right?
believe Nate handed that to me.
Okay, can we agree that the state crimes, none of them are as high as the federal mandatory minimum sentences?
I don't think that list had the federal mandatory minimum sentences. If it did, I didn't quite catch that, so I can't.
Alright, can we agree that 95% of crimes currently are prosecuted on the state level?
Again, I don't have that statistic. If you'd like to read a quote on that. Essentially, this problem you're claiming of mandatory minimums can be fixed very easily by simply reducing those mandatory minimums.
Okay, one last question. You agree that state cases
Sure.
can in fact, all of them be appealed to the federal courts if you want to?
Right now, state cases?
Mm-hmm.
Sure, in the current system.
Alright,
yes.
thank you. No further questions.
All right.